Capitola Black Recordings presents an unabridged recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker, or A Lady of England. Chapter 18. A Sudden Blow. During Annie Warren's absence from her home, events had occurred which were to exercise an indirect influence over the whole current of her future life. Sarah, as we have seen, had sullenly and reluctantly received from her young mistress the charge to watch over her blind child and attend to the wants of her sick husband. The girl had set her heart on running to a neighbour's, just over the way, to have a gossip with the school companion who was passing the day at the place. This hope frustrated, Sarah set about the performance of her duties in a peevish, irritable mood. She was angry with Nettie because he was not disposed to relieve her of trouble by going to sleep. She burnt the beef tea which she had to heat for her master, spilt half of it carrying it upstairs, and by way of not letting out the little fire which had been lighted in Warren's sick room, emptied the coal scuttle upon it, and stirred it to the heat of a furnace. Fortunately for Sarah, her master was too drowsy for any strong ebullition of passion, and after grumbling a little over his spoilt beverage, quietly composed himself to sleep. Nettie also, by dint of violent patting and rude rocking to and fro, at length ceased to fret after his absent mother, and closed his blind eyes in repose. "Now is my time," thought Sarah as she laid the little child on his small mattress in the room occupied by his sleeping father. "They'll keep quiet enough for 10 minutes while I run over for a chat with Meg Wiggins." Leaving the outer door open, as she would otherwise have no means of re-entering the house, Sarah hurried across the road, and soon, in merry colloquy with her schoolfellow, totally forgot the bedridden sufferer and the helpless little one confided to her care. Martin awoke before long and called for his wife, then uttered an impatient exclamation on recollection that he himself had sent her away. Though his limbs were still utterly powerless, he had the free use of his arms, and finding that no one responded to his voice, Warren angrily rang the bell. "The room is like an oven," he exclaimed, "with a roaring fire that might roast an ox." And again he pulled the bell rope until it came down in his hand. "There does not seem to be a living soul in the place," exclaimed the irritated man, drawing back the curtain of his bed. His eye fell on his sleeping son. It was a sight to calm the fiercest passion. Fair as a cherub looked the slumbering child, his softly rounded features bright with a delicate rose, his golden locks falling back from his white brow, while the little form lay folded in an attitude of grace that might have formed a study for a sculptor. Warren gazed at the child with admiring love, but even the gentler and better feelings of the father's nature were embittered by his sceptical spirit. "My guiltless boy, my innocent little one, slumbering there so unconscious of trouble. He will be involved in my ruin. He will be crushed in my fall. Let the parson talk to me no longer of the goodness and mercy of God. Why am I stricken down in the prime of my manhood, made a misery to myself and a burden to others, stopped in the midst of my career and condemned to this helplessness and pain?" As the words left his lips, the child stirred, unfolded his little arms, stretched himself on his mattress, and softly called out for his mother. There was a smile on his rosy lips, as if he had been awakened by an angel's whisper. "Lie still, my boy," said Martin Warren. "Mother will soon return." But the blind child was not disposed to lie still. He was too young to understand his father's words, and he held out his arms as if to feel for her whose fond caress he instinctively sought. Disappointed by his hope, Nettie rolled himself from his mattress on the floor, and once more in pleading accents lisped the word, "Mamma." Warren again tried to speak soothingly to his little son, but his was not the voice which the blind child knew and loved. Nettie laid hold with his tiny hands of one of the legs of the bed, and being a strong, active child, raised himself to a standing position. The father grew very uneasy. He found himself more helpless than an infant, left in sole charge of a child who could not understand, and who would not obey him, but who was of an age to run into dangers which he had not sight or sense to avoid. Warren called again for his servant, and so loudly that he startled and frightened his boy, who, uttering a little cry, held out his hands to balance himself, and with shoeless feet trotted off to a more distant part of the room, where he stood leaning on a cushioned chair which happened to be in his path. "Thank God he did not run towards the fire," was the involuntary exclamation of the father, who had watched the movement with no small alarm. Nervously anxious for the safety of the child, Warren attempted to rise from his bed, but to do so he found impossible, and the effort almost convulsed him with pain. Wishing to lure back the little wanderer to his side, Warren spoke to him in gentlest tones, called him by every tender name, promised him sweetmeats and rewards, and jingled the empty cup beside him, that the tinkling sound might attract the blind boy. But Nettie was not to be bribed or allured. The child had not found what he sought. He wanted his mother, and was restless until he again should be pressed to her heart. Martin perceived with horror that his little nestling was prepared for another bold flight, and that the face of his sightless darling was turned directly towards the fire. The agony of years seemed concentrated in that moment. Helpless himself, the once skeptical Warren prayed fervently, wildly to his God. He dreaded the next moment to see his boy wrapped in flames, shrieking for the aid which his maddened father had no power to give. The child starts on his perilous journey, unconscious of the awful danger before him, opening his little arms wide as if to embrace the burning death. With a cry of anguish, Warren snatches up the cup at his side, and with the energy of despair flings it at the tottering child. It strikes the little one on the chest. He falls on the floor, crying and sobbing with terror and pain, but stopped, at least for a time, in his perilous career, unharmed yet by the fierce red flames. A few minutes after, to Warren's unspeakable relief, he heard a quick step on the stair. Mr. Manton had just re-entered the house, and attracted by the loud cries of the child, he hastily entered the sick man's apartment. As the mountain's weight of suspense was thus suddenly removed from his heart, Martin Warren turned his face to the pillow, and it was wet with the father's tears. The clergyman lifted up the sobbing child, examined the bruise on his chest, soothed him at length into silence, and placed him in the arms of his parent. Warren was by this time sufficiently composed to give an account of the terrible circumstances which had forced him to strike his own child to the earth. "Was it not an act of cruelty?" asked Manton. "Of cruelty?" replied the astonished father. "It was rather an act of love. It was to save my boy from destruction. You can understand this in the dealings of an earthly parent towards his child. May it not be the same in those of the all-wise Father? May he not sometimes in mercy lay low his wandering children to save them from a more terrible fate towards which they are blindly running?" Mr. Manton said no more on the subject. He left the mind of the conscience-stricken father to trace the parallel and draw forth the lesson. He saw that an impression had been made, and silently lifted up his heart in prayer that such impression might be deep and abiding. When he next addressed Martin Warren, it was in a different tone. "How came you," inquired the clergyman, "to be left alone with the child?" "My wife has gone out," answered Warren. "I am glad that she is taking a little fresh air," observed Mr. Manton, who had not forgotten the mission which he had undertaken. "Mrs. Warren looks much exhausted by confinement to the house, and the fatigue and anxiety of nursing. If any relative were here to relieve her, it might be the means of preserving her health, and avoiding all risk of the recurrence of the fearful danger which has cost you so much anxiety today. I would not go over the last half-hour again for the wealth of the Indies," exclaimed Warren. "Have you any relative whom you could invite?" "I? No, not one who would nurse a sick man, or share the poverty of a ruined one." "Mrs. Warren has a mother." Could not she be persuaded to come? Martin Warren bit his lip. It was a humiliating moment. At any other time, his feelings would have exploded in anger. Was he to sue for her kindness in adversity on whom, in prosperity, he had closed his door? Was he to endure the presence of a woman in whose heart he had fixed a barbed arrow, in whose whole life, principles, and conduct had been in direct opposition to his own? Mr. Manton did not at once press the point, but left the suggestion to work. He presently, however, so quietly and truthfully represented the delicate state of Annie's health, the helpless condition of her child, the comfort of having one in the house who would think, act, and feel for the family, that he at length obtained Martin Warren's consent to write and invite Mrs. Laver to his home. "From what I know and have heard of the widow's character," thought Edward Manton, as he gladly took up his writing materials, "I trust that she will come as the dove of peace to this miserable home. She may strengthen the weak principles of her daughter, and confirm any new-born good resolutions of Warren, and by her activity, intelligence, and good sense, prove one of the heaven's best blessings to them both." The expectations of the missionary were not to be disappointed. The terrible lesson of that day had not been given to Martin Warren in vain. Thank you for listening to Capitola Black Recordings. I hope you have enjoyed this recording of The Lost Jewel by Charlotte Marie Tucker.